The doorbell above the entrance jingled all night, but the one sound I kept waiting for, the heavy thud of my son walking in, never came. I had decorated the table nearest the window just for them, polished the silverware until it gleamed, and even added a little vase with fresh lilies, because I knew they were my daughter-in-law's favorite. But hour after hour passed, and their chairs sat empty, taunting me. By the time the last guest had left, I found myself standing in the middle of my restaurant, alone, staring at that table. My heart ached in a way that hard work, exhaustion, and even loneliness had never managed to make it ache before. I had always believed that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and loved deeply enough, the people I loved most would be there for me. That night, in the warm golden glow of my dream, finally realized I was faced with the cold truth. I wasn't their priority. And then, just as I reached for the key to lock up, my phone buzzed. My son's name lit up the screen. I hesitated, my hand trembling, before I finally answered. His voice on the other end wasn't what I expected. It wasn't apologetic. It wasn't ashamed. No, it was something else entirely. Something that made me go from hurt to furious. But before I take you further into the moment that changed everything, I want to say this. Stories like mine take hours of work to craft and share with you. If you've ever enjoyed these tales of heartbreak, revenge, and redemption, please consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it makes the countless late nights I spend writing feel worth it. That call was the spark, the moment everything shifted. The woman who quietly swallowed disrespect died right there in my little restaurant in Portland, Oregon. What rose in her place was someone sharper, stronger, and unwilling to be dismissed again. And if you think this story ends with me wiping away tears and forgiving quietly, think again. This was the beginning of my revenge. When I was a little girl growing up in Portland, Oregon, my mother used to tell me that if you wanted something badly enough, you had to be willing to outwork everyone else for it. She wasn't a woman who sugar-coated life. She was a waitress who raised 3 kids on her own after my dad walked out when I was 9. I watched her drag herself to the diner at 5 a.m. and stumble home at midnight, her hands raw from washing dishes, her knees aching from hours on her feet. I swore to myself that I would do whatever it took to give my own children something better. That promise was the fuel that carried me through years of double shifts, sleepless nights, and the endless grind of putting money aside. My dream wasn't fancy. I didn't want a mansion or a yacht. I just wanted to build a place of my own, a little dinner spot where people felt like family, where no one ever had to eat alone unless they chose to. So when the grand opening finally came, it wasn't just about business. It was about survival, resilience, and proving to myself that every sacrifice meant something. And most of all, it was about family. Family. That word used to feel warm on my tongue. Now it just feels heavy. My son, Daniel, is 32. He was my firstborn, the one I poured every ounce of energy into. When his father left, I worked overtime to make sure Daniel didn't feel the gap. I showed up at every soccer game, every school play, every doctor's appointment. I was the mom in the stands with the loudest clap, the mom who baked cupcakes for the whole team when they lost a game just so the sting wouldn't feel as sharp. I wasn't perfect, no parent is, but I tried. And in return, I thought I had his love and respect. Daniel was always ambitious, a hard worker like me. He went to the University of Oregon, got his degree in business, and married Amanda, a woman I truly believed was his match. Amanda wasn't cruel, at least not outright. But she had a way of making me feel small without saying much at all. A raised eyebrow here, a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, a subtle dig about my job. "Oh, your mom works in a diner?" "That's quaint," she once said at Thanksgiving, twirling her wine glass between her fingers as if she were some queen presiding over peasants. I brushed it off, telling myself she didn't mean anything by it. But deep down, I felt the sting. Still, I tried. I went out of my way to include her, to make her feel welcome. When she and Daniel got engaged, I helped plan the bridal shower. When she got her first big promotion at a Portland firm, I bought her a designer purse I couldn't really afford, just to show her how proud I was. But no matter what I did, I always felt like I was standing on the outside of their glass house, watching their lives from a distance. Which brings me back to that night. I had imagined Daniel and Amanda walking in, smiling, maybe even tearing up when they saw the little reserve sign I had placed on their table. I imagined introducing them proudly to my guests. This is my son and his wife. Everything I've done for them. But instead, I learned through a neighbor who had seen pictures online that they had gone to Amanda's mother's promotion party instead. A promotion party for her mother. It wasn't just the choice they made, it was the statement behind it. My dream, something I had worked decades to achieve, wasn't as important as clinking glasses at a corporate celebration for someone who already had everything. When I found that out, it wasn't just my heart that broke. Something inside me shifted. That phone call Daniel made at the end of the night, that's what snapped the last thread. His voice was casual, even cheerful, like nothing had happened. "Hey, Mom," he said. "Sorry we couldn't make it tonight. We were at Mom's party. Oh, I mean Amanda's mom's party. It was kind of a big deal. You understand, right? You understand." Two little words that burned hotter than anything else. Did he understand the months I spent scraping together savings? Did he understand the 14-hour days on my feet to pay for the oven that now sat gleaming in my kitchen? Did he understand that I had been sitting there, watching the door, waiting for him until the candles on their table melted down to stubs? I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him how he could betray me like that. But all I said was, I hope it was worth it. Then I hung up. And for the first time in years, I felt something harden inside me. But before we get into how that moment changed me, I need you to understand who I am and why this betrayal cut so deep. I'm 57 years old. My whole life has been about showing up for others. When Daniel was born, I was 25 and terrified, but I threw myself into motherhood like it was the most important job in the world. When his little sister, Rachel, came along 3 years later, I did it all over again. 2 kids, 2 jobs, and barely enough money to keep the lights on. But I did it. I've always been the reliable one. The shoulder to cry on, the emergency contact, the person people knew they could lean on. And maybe that's why I never saw it coming when the people I loved most decided I wasn't worth showing up for. Rachel, my daughter, lives in Seattle now. She couldn't make it to the grand opening either, but at least she called me days in advance with genuine regret in her voice. That stung, but it was different. With Daniel and Amanda, it wasn't just absence, it was a choice. Amanda's family is wealthy. The kind of wealthy that throws parties in downtown high-rise penthouses with champagne fountains and live jazz. I've been to a few of their gatherings, and I always felt like the poor relative who had stumbled into the wrong room. They'd smile politely, ask about my work as if it were a hobby, then quickly move on to real conversations about investments and vacation homes. So when Amanda's mother got her big promotion at her firm, it was no surprise that they threw a lavish party. And I guess it was no surprise, either, that Daniel and Amanda chose that over me. But knowing doesn't soften the blow. That night, standing alone in my restaurant, I realized something important. My son and his wife didn't just miss my opening. They dismissed me. They showed me exactly where I stood in their hierarchy of importance, and it wasn't anywhere near the top. I locked up the restaurant, drove home through the quiet streets of Portland, and sat in my kitchen staring at the walls. My hands were still sticky from frosting I had piped onto cupcakes earlier that day. Little treats I had hoped to share with Daniel and Amanda. They were sitting in a Tupperware container on the counter, untouched. For hours, I replayed everything in my head. Every sacrifice I had made. Every time I had chosen to put them first. And now I was the afterthought. That realization cut deeper than I could explain. But it also did something else. It lit a fire. You see, I am my mother's daughter. I might cry, but I don't crumble. I might break, but I don't stay broken. That night, I decided something. If Daniel and Amanda couldn't see my worth, I would show them in a way they would never forget. I didn't know exactly how yet, but the seed had been planted. The woman who had spent her life bending over backward to be loved was gone. The woman who would make them regret underestimating her had just been born. And so began the quiet shift in my life. When I walked back into my restaurant the next morning, I didn't see the empty chairs anymore. I saw possibilities. I saw the strength it had taken to build those walls, paint those tables, and hang those curtains. And I thought, If I could create this from nothing, I could certainly handle teaching a few lessons to people who thought I was nothing. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about showing my son, his wife, and maybe even myself that I was not invisible, not replaceable, and certainly not to be taken for granted. The plan wasn't clear yet, but the resolve was. And as you'll see in the chapters to come, when a woman like me decides she's done being dismissed, the fallout can be catastrophic. I didn't sleep much that night. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the call from Daniel like a broken record. The words, "you understand, right?" echoed in my head until they felt less like a question and more like a command. He wanted me to accept it, to swallow my feelings, to do what I'd always done. Make excuses for him, forgive quietly, and move on. But something in me snapped. The next morning, I drove to the restaurant early. The streets of Portland were still waking up, cafes setting out chairs, the Max train humming in the distance, joggers weaving through the park blocks. I unlocked the door, inhaled the faint scent of cinnamon and coffee from yesterday's opening, and sat down at the table I had reserved for Daniel and Amanda. The lilies had wilted overnight, their petals drooping like little heads bowed in shame. I stared at those flowers until anger rose in my throat like bile. I grabbed the vase, dumped it into the trash, and whispered to the empty room, "No more." That was the moment I decided this wasn't just hurt feelings, it was betrayal. You have to understand something about me. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. My whole life, I've avoided fights, smoothed over conflicts, kept the peace. But this wasn't a simple oversight. This was my son deliberately choosing someone else's celebration over the culmination of my life's work. It wasn't just that he didn't show up. It was that he didn't care. Later that week, I tried to test the waters. I texted Daniel a simple message. "Hey, I hope you and Amanda are doing well. Can we grab lunch soon? I'd love to talk." His reply came hours later. "Can't this week, super busy. Maybe sometime later." No apology. No acknowledgement of missing the grand opening. Just a brush off. That text was the nail in the coffin. If the phone call had been the spark, that text was the gasoline. Here's where the triggering event really came to a head. A family dinner at Amanda's parents' house a few weeks later. I almost didn't go. I still felt raw, still carried the weight of that empty chair. But Rachel, my daughter, called me and said, "Mom, please go. Maybe you'll get a chance to talk to Daniel in person." So I baked a pie, put on a smile, and drove across town. Their house was everything mine wasn't: sleek, modern, expensive. Glass walls, granite counters, a chandelier that looked like it cost more than my car. The moment I stepped inside, I felt small. Amanda's parents greeted me politely but distractedly, as though I were just another guest to be tolerated. Daniel and Amanda were sitting on the couch, laughing, drinks in hand, perfectly at ease. I wanted to hug my son, to remind myself that he was still the boy I raised. But before I could even take off my coat, Amanda's mother said loudly, "Daniel, thank you again for being at my promotion party. It meant the world to me to have you there." Daniel smiled, raised his glass, and said, "Of course. Wouldn't have missed it for the world." Those words were like a punch in the gut. Wouldn't have missed it for the world. He had missed mine. Dinner was worse. At the long, polished table, conversation flowed easily around me. But I sat there in silence, feeling invisible. They talked about business trips, stocks, new cars, vacation homes. At one point, Amanda's father turned to Daniel and said, "So, your mom finally opened that little restaurant, huh?" "That little restaurant." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, she's really proud of it. It's cute. Cute. That was it. Cute." He might as well have slapped me across the face. I had poured my soul into that place, mortgaged my future on it, worked until my body ached every night. And in front of a table full of people, my son reduced it to cute. I gripped my fork so tightly my knuckles went white. The pie I had brought sat untouched at the end of the table, forgotten, while dessert from some upscale bakery was passed around instead. By the time I excused myself to leave, I felt humiliated, belittled, and completely erased. That night, when I got home, I sat in the dark of my kitchen, pie still in its carrier on the counter. I opened it, cut myself a slice, and forced it down even though it tasted like ash in my mouth. And as I chewed, I realized something. Daniel wasn't just thoughtless. He had made a choice. He had chosen Amanda's family, their wealth, their world. And in doing so, he had pushed me out. That dinner was the triggering event. Not just the empty chair at my grand opening. Not just the phone call. Not just the text. But the culmination of all of it. Him sitting there at that glossy table, dismissing my life's work as cute while Amanda's family looked down their noses at me. That was the night the switch flipped. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was done. Driving back to my restaurant the next morning, I felt different. Stronger. Colder. I parked outside, stared at the sign I had painted with my own hands, and whispered to myself, they don't get to do this to me. I had spent my entire life giving, forgiving, and showing up. But forgiveness is a luxury you can't afford when the people you love use it as a weapon. I knew then. It was time to stop waiting for apologies that would never come. It was time to start planning. Because if Daniel and Amanda couldn't respect me as their mother, then maybe they'd learn to respect the consequences of underestimating me. When I woke up the morning after that dinner at Amanda's parents' house, I felt like my body had been filled with cement. Heavy, unmovable, suffocating. I lay there staring at the ceiling of my little apartment above the restaurant, replaying Daniel's voice in my head. Yeah, she's really proud of it. It's cute. That word rattled around in my skull until it became unbearable. Cute. Puppies are cute. Toddlers in Halloween costumes are cute. But a restaurant built from blood, sweat, and every ounce of my savings? No, that was not cute. That was survival, ambition, and sacrifice given form. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cool wooden floor. For a long moment, I just sat there, clutching my knees, shaking. Then I stood, pulled on my work clothes, and went downstairs to the restaurant. The place was quiet, filled with the faint smell of last night's cooking. Chairs neatly tucked under tables, lights dim, countertops gleaming. It should have felt like peace. Instead, it felt like a graveyard of dreams no one cared about except me. I went straight to the table where I had once set out lilies for Daniel and Amanda. I stared at the empty space, and for the first time in my life, I let the anger take over. My whole body trembled, my chest tightened, and I whispered through clenched teeth, enough. I don't usually raise my voice, not even when I'm angry. But that day, I did something uncharacteristic. I grabbed the little reserve sign I had saved, the one I had lovingly set on their table for the grand opening, and I hurled it against the wall. It clattered to the floor with a sound that echoed through the room, sharp and final. The release startled me. I bent down, picked up the pieces, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilt for being angry. I felt justified. For years, I had been swallowing disrespect, convincing myself it wasn't worth making a fuss. But sitting at Amanda's parents' dinner table, listening to my son dismiss me as if I were nothing, that was the last straw. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and started chopping vegetables with a force that matched my rage. The rhythm of the blades slamming against the cutting board was oddly therapeutic. With each slice, I thought of every moment I had bitten my tongue. Every time Amanda's snide remarks had gone unchecked. Every time Daniel had brushed me aside, like I was a second-class citizen in his new life. The vegetables didn't deserve it, but my fury needed somewhere to go. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. For a moment, I almost didn't pick up. But my hands moved on their own, and before I knew it, the phone was against my ear. "Hey, Mom," he said, casual as ever. "Thanks for coming last night. Amanda's parents really appreciated it." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. "You're welcome. You didn't have to bring a pie, though," he added with a chuckle. "They're more into, high-end stuff. But it was sweet of you. Sweet. Cute." Those words landed like little daggers. I took a deep breath. "Daniel," I said slowly, "do you have any idea how much it hurt me when you didn't show up for my grand opening?" There was a pause. Then he sighed. "Mom, come on. We've been over this. Amanda's mom's promotion was a big deal. You understand. No apology. No remorse. Just dismissal." Something inside me cracked wide open. "No, Daniel," I said. my voice sharper than I'd ever allowed it to be with him. I don't understand. I don't understand how you could look at everything I've sacrificed, everything I've built, and choose to be somewhere else. I don't understand how you could reduce my life's work to something cute. I don't understand how you can sit there and act like my dreams don't matter. He groaned. Mom, don't be dramatic. It's just a restaurant. Just a restaurant. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Every instinct in me wanted to scream, to curse, to unleash the hurricane swirling in my chest. But instead, I chose silence. Deadly, deliberate silence. After a long pause, I said quietly, "One day, Daniel, you're going to wish you hadn't said that." Then I hung up. That moment, that clean break on the phone, was the bold line in the sand. I wasn't just his mom anymore, waiting for scraps of attention and affection. I was a woman reclaiming her dignity. When I put the phone down, I felt strangely calm. My hands stopped trembling. My heart slowed. Because in that moment, I made a decision. If my son couldn't respect me as his mother, I would make him respect me as a force he couldn't ignore. It wasn't about screaming or throwing tantrums. It was about power. And the first step to reclaiming power is silence, the kind of silence that unsettles the guilty more than words ever could. I wiped down the counter, set the phone aside, and whispered to myself, "This is the beginning." That night, I sat in the restaurant after closing, lights dimmed, only the glow of the neon sign outside seeping in. I thought about my mother, about how she had never let people walk all over her, no matter how poor or tired she was. And I thought about all the times I had chosen to stay small, to keep the peace, to let things slide. No more. That was the moment I stopped being a victim in my own story. That was the moment I chose revenge, not the messy, impulsive kind, but the kind that simmers, waits, and strikes when it will hurt the most. And as I locked up that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. If you were in my shoes, if your own child had dismissed your life's dream as nothing more than cute, or just a restaurant, would you have stayed silent too? Or would you have unleashed every bit of rage boiling inside you? I know what I chose, and I don't regret it. After that phone call with Daniel, I couldn't shake the silence that followed. It wasn't the silence between us. I had chosen that deliberately. It was the silence inside of me. A strange, powerful quiet that felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, I wasn't scrambling to fix things. I wasn't rehearsing apologies for feelings that weren't mine to carry. I wasn't begging for scraps of affection. I was just still. And in that stillness, clarity began to creep in. I had spent decades running on fumes, sacrificing every part of myself to give my children the life I never had. I had worked myself raw, never asking for thanks, never demanding recognition. And in return, my son couldn't even carve out one evening to celebrate the biggest accomplishment of my life. That realization stung like salt in a wound, but it also woke something in me. I remember sitting at the restaurant late one night, long after the last customer had left. The air was thick with the smell of garlic and butter. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. I sat at one of the booths with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring out the window at the street lamps glowing against the dark Portland sky. In that booth, I let my mind wander back through the years. I thought about the day Daniel was born. I was 25, scared out of my mind, but when the nurse placed him in my arms, I swore I would give him everything. I thought about the nights I came home from double shifts, my back aching, but still sat on the floor with him to build Lego castles until we both nodded off. I thought about the mornings I skipped breakfast so he could have a packed lunch with his favorite sandwich. Every memory was a reminder I had given him my all. And then I thought about Amanda, her perfectly pressed suits, her manicured nails, her condescending smile. How she looked at me like I was some relic of the past, something her husband had outgrown. She had the kind of confidence that came from never having to struggle, never having to wonder how rent would get paid or whether there'd be food in the fridge. She hadn't built her world. She'd inherited it. And Daniel, my Daniel, had slipped so easily into that world that he'd forgotten where he came from. That was the moment I made my choice. I couldn't change the past, and I couldn't force Daniel to see my worth. But I could change how I carried myself moving forward. I could stop giving them access to me so freely. Stop letting them think I'd always be waiting in the wings. I whispered it out loud to myself, the words sharp in the stillness. No more begging for a seat at their table. They'll beg for mine. The idea of revenge wasn't about pettiness, it was about balance. For too long, the scales had been tipped in their favor. They dismissed me, diminished me, took my love for granted. Now it was time for them to feel the absence of it. The turning point came when I realized that revenge doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be messy. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is to quietly reclaim your power, to stop feeding people who wouldn't notice if you starved. So I began making small changes. The first was money. Every year, like clockwork, I gave Daniel and Amanda generous gifts for birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. I'd save for months to afford them. The purse, the watches, the fancy gadgets. This time, I decided those days were over. My money would go into my restaurant, into myself, into people who actually appreciated me. The second was my time. I had always been available to Daniel at the drop of a hat. A flat tire? I was there. A forgotten lunchbox? I dropped it off. Even as an adult, he called me for little conveniences. But now, when his text came, "Mom, can you do me a favor?" I let them sit unanswered. At first, it was hard. The instinct to rush in, to help, to fix, that was ingrained in me. But every time I resisted, I felt a little stronger. One evening, about a month after the disastrous family dinner, Amanda texted me directly. "Hey, we're hosting a brunch this weekend. Can you bring one of your pies? Everyone loves them." I stared at the message for a long time. Old me would have baked 2 pies, wrapped them in ribbons, and arrived early to help set up. But this new version of me, I typed one simple response. "Sorry, I'm busy." No explanation. No apology. Just 3 words. And let me tell you, hitting send felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. The funny thing about setting boundaries is that the people who benefit from your lack of them are always the first to complain. Daniel called the next day. "Mom, Amanda said you can't make brunch? You always come to these things." I smiled to myself, unseen on the other end of the line. "I'm busy," I repeated. "With what?" he pressed. "With my life, Daniel," I said calmly. "With the restaurant. With myself." He didn't like that answer. I could hear the frustration in his silence. But instead of arguing, he muttered, "Fine," and hung up. For once, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. As the weeks passed, I began pouring more of myself into the restaurant, not just as a business, but as a sanctuary. I greeted every customer like family, remembered their favorite dishes, decorated for the seasons. Word started to spread. Soon, people who had never heard of me were showing up, curious about the cozy little dinner spot with the warm atmosphere. Every time I saw a new face walk through that door, I felt stronger. Because while Daniel and Amanda dismissed me, the community was beginning to see my worth. That was the real turning point, realizing that their rejection didn't define me. Their absence didn't diminish the love and effort I had put into my life. If anything, it freed me to give that energy to people who deserved it. And let me pause here to say something to you, dear reader. It takes me hours upon hours to pour my heart into telling these stories, revisiting the pain, shaping the details, and sharing the lessons I've learned. If you've read this far, it means you care. So please, do me one small favor, subscribe. It's a simple click for you, but for me, it's the encouragement that keeps me going. Now back to the story. Reclaiming my power didn't mean the hurt vanished. There were nights I still lay awake, wondering where I went wrong with Daniel, wondering if I should have raised my voice sooner, demanded respect earlier, cut Amanda's influence off before it grew so strong. But then I'd remind myself, I did the best I could with what I had. And now, it was Daniel's turn to live with his choices. My role was no longer to cushion him from the consequences. My role was to stand tall in my own life and let him feel the void where my unconditional support used to be. The more distance I created, the more cracks began to show. Daniel started calling more often, his tone less casual, more strained. Amanda's texts became more frequent, her politeness thinner, her demands sharper. It was subtle at first, but I could feel the shift. They were used to me being their safety net. Now that it was gone, they were beginning to notice. And that, more than anything, confirmed I had made the right choice. The woman who had been dismissed, overlooked, and minimized was gone. In her place stood someone unrecognizable to them, but finally recognizable to herself. When people think of revenge, they usually picture something loud, explosive, maybe even dramatic enough to make the evening news. But that's not me. That's never been me. I don't throw plates against walls or storm into rooms shouting accusations. No, my kind of revenge is quieter, sharper, the kind that seeps under the skin without you even realizing it. Until one day you wake up and the life you built feels like it's slipping out from under you. That's what Daniel and Amanda were about to learn. It started small, almost invisible to anyone but me. For years, I had been their safety net. If Amanda forgot to pick up dry cleaning, I went. If Daniel needed help with paperwork, I filled it out. When their apartment had a leaky faucet, I was the one under the sink with a wrench while they stood by scrolling on their phones. So I stopped. I stopped being the person who smoothed over their rough edges, who filled in the gaps, who made their lives easier. The next time Daniel called me to ask if I could pick up groceries since they were too busy, I simply said, "No, I can't." The silence on the other end of the line told me everything. He didn't know how to respond because he had never heard me say no before. And when Amanda texted asking if I could sew a button back on her expensive blouse, something she could have easily done herself or taken to a tailor, I didn't even reply. Every small refusal was like a stitch in a new tapestry I was weaving, a world where they didn't get to use me. Then came the holidays. In the past, Christmas at my place had been a big deal. I cooked for days, wrapped presents with ribbons, made the house smell like cinnamon and pine. Daniel and Amanda always arrived late, but they came with big smiles, ready to eat and collect gifts I had saved up to buy. This time, I changed the script. I decorated the restaurant instead of my apartment. I invited neighbors, old coworkers, even a few loyal customers who didn't have family nearby. The place was warm, filled with laughter and music. The tables overflowed with food, every dish made with love. But there were no gifts for Daniel or Amanda under the tree. They showed up late as usual, and I could see the confusion on Amanda's face when she scanned the room and realized this wasn't her stage anymore. Daniel gave me a small, awkward hug, and Amanda sat stiffly at one of the tables, clearly irritated by the mix of people she didn't know. When the time came to exchange gifts, I handed presents to everyone else. I gave a hand-knit scarf to my neighbor Linda, who always brought me fresh herbs from her garden. I gave a framed photo of the restaurant to my old coworker Sarah, who had cheered me on through every step of building it. But when Amanda's eyes flicked to the empty spot where her gift should have been, I simply smiled and said, "This year, I decided to focus on people who truly support me." The color drained from her face. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, and in that moment I savored the power shift. But the real slow burn wasn't in the gifts. It was in the way I began to pull strings behind the scenes. Amanda worked at a law firm downtown, and while I wasn't part of her world, Portland is a smaller city than people realize. One of my regulars at the restaurant, a kind older man named George, had been in the local business scene for decades. Over coffee one afternoon, he mentioned he knew some of the partners at Amanda's firm. I didn't say much. I just listened, nodded, and tucked that piece of information away. The next time Amanda made a backhanded comment at dinner, something about how some people just aren't cut out for professional success, I smiled sweetly and thought, "Careful, dear. You don't know who you're underestimating." Because that's the beauty of running a restaurant. People talk when they eat. They relax. They share stories. They drop names. And I was paying attention. But revenge isn't just about them. It was also about me. I started taking better care of myself in ways I had neglected for years. I joined a yoga class in downtown Portland, started walking along the Willamette River in the mornings, even treated myself to a few nice outfits that made me feel confident again. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. People noticed. Customers complimented me. Rachel, my daughter, called one day and said, "Mom, you sound lighter." And she was right. Because revenge isn't just about making someone else hurt. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to erase. One of the most satisfying shifts came with Amanda's parents. They had always looked down on me, treating me like an amusing side character in their shiny world. But when word started spreading about my restaurant, when local Portland food blogs began writing glowing reviews and customers lined up out the door, they couldn't ignore it anymore. At a family gathering, Amanda's mother asked me, with a tight smile, "So, your little restaurant is doing well?" I returned her smile with one of my own, calm and measured. "Yes, we were just featured in Portland Monthly. They called it a hidden gem with a heart as warm as the food." The look on her face was priceless, surprise mixed with irritation, like she couldn't believe the woman she had dismissed as a waitress was now being celebrated in her city. And Daniel, sitting beside her, looked down at his plate, avoiding my eyes. He knew he had missed the chance to be part of that moment. The best part of slow burn revenge is watching the cracks form. They're small at first, easy to overlook. But once they start, they spread. Amanda began texting me more frequently. Little things like, "Are you free this weekend?" or "We should come by the restaurant sometime." I ignored most of them. When I did reply, it was polite but distant. Daniel, on the other hand, started calling with flimsy excuses. "Hey, Mom, just checking in," he'd say, his voice awkward. The calls were shorter, more strained, as though he wasn't sure where we stood anymore. That uncertainty was the sweetest part of all, because for the first time in years, the power dynamic had shifted. They were the ones reaching, and I was the one choosing when or if I wanted to answer. The slow burn wasn't about ruining their lives overnight. It was about teaching them, piece by piece, what it felt like to lose access to me. To lose the woman who had always given without asking for anything back. To lose the safety net they had mistaken for weakness. To lose the unconditional love they had assumed would always be there, no matter how they treated me. And the beauty of it all was that I didn't have to raise my voice or throw a single insult. I just had to step back and let them feel the emptiness of my absence. By the time spring rolled around, the restaurant was thriving. The neighborhood had embraced it as a staple, a cozy spot where people came not just to eat, but to connect. I saw first dates blossom into relationships. Lonely widowers find comfort in familiar faces. Children grow into young adults who brought their friends back years later. It was everything I had dreamed of and more. And Daniel and Amanda? They were on the outside looking in, just like I had once been with their polished world. That, to me, was the sweetest revenge of all. Revenge, when done right, doesn't feel like revenge at all. It feels like balance being restored. Like the universe finally deciding to tip the scales in your favor after years of watching you stumble under the weight of other people's entitlement. And let me tell you, by the time spring turned into summer in Portland, those scales were tipping. Hard. It started with Amanda's brunch crowd. You see, Amanda liked to present herself as the queen of polished social gatherings. Every few weeks, she hosted brunch at her place in the Pearl District. Picture it, avocado toast, bottomless mimosas, guests in designer clothes, jazz music floating in the background. She lived for the photos, the Instagram posts, the validation. But here's the thing about social circles in Portland, people talk. And thanks to my restaurant slowly becoming a community hub, I had more ears in more places than Amanda ever realized. One Saturday morning, a regular named Nina came in for breakfast with a few friends. Over coffee, I overheard her mention Amanda's latest brunch. "You know," Nina said, "it's funny. She always talks about how supportive she is of her husband's family. But I heard she didn't even show up for her mother-in-law's grand opening." Can you imagine? The others gasped, exchanged knowing looks, and just like that, a tiny seed of doubt about Amanda and Daniel's character was planted in another circle. I didn't have to say a word. My silence, my story, and the people who had witnessed my pain were doing the work for me. The next ripple came at Amanda's job. Remember George, the older man who was a regular at my restaurant and happened to know some of the partners at her law firm? One evening, he lingered after dinner, complimenting the food, as usual. Then he said casually, "I heard you had a rough time with your family during your opening. That must have been tough." I shrugged. It was, but life goes on. The restaurant's thriving, and I have people who support me. George nodded thoughtfully. You know, people notice those things. Loyalty matters, not just in families, but in business too. The way he said it made me think he wasn't just talking about me. And sure enough, a few weeks later, I heard whispers from another customer, someone who worked at the same firm, that Amanda's people skills were being quietly questioned by the higher-ups. I didn't need to push. I just had to let the truth find its way into the right ears. But the biggest crack came within the family itself. Rachel, my daughter in Seattle, had been watching everything unfold from a distance. She had always been more empathetic, more in tune with my feelings than Daniel ever was. One evening, she called me, her voice tight. "Mom, I saw Amanda posted pictures from that brunch last month," she said. "And it just hit me you weren't in any of them." I swallowed hard. No, I wasn't invited. There was a long silence, and then Rachel whispered, "That's disgusting. After everything you've done for them, after everything you've sacrificed, how could they treat you like that?" I could hear the anger in her voice, the kind of righteous fury I had buried in myself for so long. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. Rachel started distancing herself from Daniel and Amanda, too. She called me more, visited when she could, and even brought her friends to the restaurant, proudly telling them, "This is my mom." She built this place from nothing. That shift meant the world to me. Because while Daniel was slipping further away, Rachel was stepping closer, and I finally understood that I didn't need both of my children to validate me. I just needed the ones who chose to see me. The fallout wasn't just emotional, it was social. One Saturday night, Daniel and Amanda walked into my restaurant unannounced. They had a couple of friends with them, dressed sharply, clearly expecting the kind of treatment they were used to. Amanda scanned the crowded dining room, her smile tight when she realized there were no empty tables. "Hi," she said to me at the host's stand, her voice saccharine. "Can you squeeze us in?" "It's us." I met her gaze calmly. "I'm sorry, we're fully booked tonight." Her smile faltered. "But we're family." I tilted my head. "So, are the people who made reservations weeks ago?" "I can't bump them." The look on her face, equal parts shock and outrage, was priceless. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed in front of his friends. They left without eating, Amanda muttering under her breath, and I watched them go with a quiet satisfaction that warmed me more than any applause ever could. That incident didn't just bruise Amanda's ego. It spread. Word of mouth travels fast in a city like Portland, and soon people were whispering. The woman who treated her mother-in-law like an afterthought couldn't even get a table at the restaurant that was now being hailed as one of the city's best. The irony was delicious. Of course, not everything was petty satisfaction. Some of it was deeply emotional. One evening, after a particularly busy night, I sat alone in the restaurant with a glass of wine. The place was quiet, just the hum of the lights and the clink of glasses as I cleaned up. My phone buzzed. It was Daniel. I stared at the screen, debating. Finally, I answered. "Mom," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Can we talk?" For a moment, my heart squeezed. The mother in me wanted to say yes, to let him explain, to hope he had finally realized how badly he had hurt me. But then I remembered his words at Amanda's parents' house. "It's cute. It's just a restaurant." I took a deep breath. "Not tonight, Daniel. I'm tired." And I hung up. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't vindictive. It was just a boundary. And for someone who had never set one with him before, it felt like reclaiming years of lost ground. By midsummer, the exposure of Daniel and Amanda's choices was complete. Their absence at my grand opening wasn't a secret anymore. It had seeped into conversations, into family dynamics, into their social circles. They weren't the golden couple they thought they were. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. All I had to do was live my life, thrive in my restaurant, and let people draw their own conclusions. The truth has a way of surfacing when you stop trying to bury it. That's when the calls started coming more frequently. Daniel would call late at night, his voice strained. "Mom, I feel like you're pulling away. Can we fix this?" Amanda, too, would send texts that read less like demands and more like olive branches. "We'd love to come by the restaurant soon. Maybe just us, no friends." But by then, I wasn't desperate for their attention anymore. I had built something they couldn't diminish, and I had surrounded myself with people who valued me. Their sudden need for reconciliation felt less like love and more like desperation. And that, to me, was the sweetest exposure of all. Watching them realize that the woman they had dismissed was no longer waiting for them at the door. When revenge is slow, people don't always realize it's happening. They think the silence is temporary, the distance is just a phase, and the withheld kindness will eventually return. But when it doesn't, that's when panic sets in. By late summer, Daniel and Amanda's panic was practically dripping through the phone whenever they reached out. Calls, texts, awkward invitations, they tried everything except the one thing that might have mattered, a genuine apology. And then one Sunday evening, the confrontation I knew was coming finally arrived. I was locking up the restaurant after another busy weekend when I heard a knock on the glass front door. I turned, keys in hand, and there they were, Daniel and Amanda, standing under the streetlight like two kids sent to the principal's office. Amanda looked polished as always, but her smile was tight, brittle. Daniel had his hands shoved in his pockets, his posture sagging with unease. I considered pretending not to see them. But something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe a sliver of old maternal instinct, made me unlock the door. "Can we talk?" Daniel asked quietly. I stepped aside. 5 minutes. We sat at a corner booth, the restaurant empty except for us. The air was thick with everything unsaid. Daniel was the first to speak. "Mom, I feel like things have changed between us." I let out a soft laugh, not unkind but edged with truth. "Changed? Daniel, things didn't just change. You changed them. You made a choice that night. Both of you did." Amanda's jaw tightened. "It wasn't personal. My mother's promotion was important, and..." I cut her off with a raised hand. "Stop. Don't stand in my restaurant and tell me it wasn't personal. Do you know what it felt like to sit here watching that door, waiting for my own son to show up? To realize you skipped my once-in-a-lifetime moment to celebrate someone else's?" Amanda flushed but stayed silent. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not asking for excuses," I continued. "I'm asking for acknowledgement, for honesty, because until you can admit what you did, there's nothing to fix." For the first time, Amanda's mask slipped. She looked at me, eyes flashing. "Do you know how hard it is to balance everything? Work, social obligations, family? You think we didn't want to be here? We just chose," I said sharply. "You chose, and that's fine. Choices have consequences." Daniel finally spoke, his voice low. "Mom, we messed up. I know we did. I don't want to lose you over one mistake." I leaned back, studying him. He looked tired, older somehow, weighed down by guilt he didn't know how to carry. For a flicker of a moment, my heart softened. This was my son, the boy I had raised, the boy who used to run to me after school with scraped knees and tearful eyes. But then I remembered that night, the empty chair, the untouched lilies, the ache of waiting, and the softness hardened again. "I'm not going to pretend nothing happened," I said evenly. "I'm not going to sweep it under the rug so you can feel better. That's what we've always done in this family, and it stops now." Amanda crossed her arms, clearly unused to being told no. "So what? You're going to hold this over us forever?" I smiled, calm and deliberate. "No, I don't need to hold anything over you. Life is already doing that for me. Look around, this restaurant is thriving. People respect me. They support me. And all of that happened without you." The words hung heavy between us. Daniel dropped his gaze, his hands clenching into fists in his lap. Amanda shifted uncomfortably, her confidence cracking. "Here's the truth," I said finally. "I'm not cutting you out, but I'm not chasing you either. If you want to be in my life, it will be on my terms. Respectful, honest, and equal. Not as people who take and dismiss, but as people who show up. Can you do that?" The silence stretched. Daniel nodded slowly, though his eyes were wet. Amanda hesitated, clearly biting back a retort, but finally gave a stiff nod. I stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "Then prove it. Not with words, with actions." As I walked them to the door, I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. What I felt was power. The quiet kind that comes from finally realizing you're not begging anyone to choose you anymore. The days after the confrontation were strangely calm. Daniel started calling more regularly, but this time, it wasn't to ask for favors. It was to ask how I was doing, to tell me about his day, to share small, human moments that didn't revolve around his needs. Amanda was slower to change, but she showed up too. One afternoon, she came into the restaurant alone. She ordered lunch, sat quietly, and when she left, she said the soup was wonderful. Thank you. No pretense, no superiority. Just a small, genuine acknowledgement. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. The biggest shift, though, was in me. For so long, I had defined myself through the lens of other people's approval, my children's, Amanda's, even strangers. But now, for the first time, I felt whole on my own. I wasn't waiting by the door. I wasn't filling empty chairs with hope. I was living my life on my terms. The confrontation hadn't given me closure, not completely. But it had given me clarity. Daniel and Amanda could choose to step up, or they could choose to drift away. Either way, I would be fine, because I had already proven to myself, to my community, and to the people who truly mattered that I was worth showing up for. And sometimes, that's all the closure you need. Redemption doesn't come in sweeping gestures. It doesn't arrive with flowers, apologies shouted in the rain, or dramatic tears at a family gathering. That's the stuff of movies. In real life, redemption looks smaller, quieter, sometimes so subtle you wonder if you're imagining it at all. After that night in the restaurant, the confrontation that had been simmering for months, I expected Daniel and Amanda to retreat, to go back to their world and pretend nothing had changed. But instead, something unexpected happened. They began to try. Not with words, with actions. The first sign came a week later. It was a Thursday afternoon, usually my slowest time at the restaurant. I was wiping down tables when the door opened and in walked Daniel. Alone. He looked out of place, standing there in his work clothes with his tie slightly askew, as though he had rushed over without overthinking it. "Hi, Mom," he said, almost sheepish. I raised an eyebrow. "To what do I owe the visit?" He shrugged. "Thought I'd grab lunch." Just me. I seated him at a corner table, and for the next 45 minutes, I watched my son eat alone in my restaurant, not with his wife, not with friends, not with an audience. Just him. Every so often, he'd look up, catch my eye, and smile. When he left, he hugged me. A simple, quiet hug that felt more genuine than any words he could have mustered. Amanda's effort came later and in her own way. One Saturday morning, I opened the restaurant to find a bouquet of lilies sitting on the doorstep. No note, no signature. Just lilies, the same flowers I had placed at her and Daniel's empty table on opening night. I didn't need a card to know who had left them. Amanda came by later that day, ordered a coffee, and said nothing about the flowers. But when she left, she paused by the door, met my eyes, and gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. For Amanda, that was monumental. The gestures continued, small and deliberate. Daniel started bringing his coworkers to the restaurant for lunch, bragging, "This is my mom's place. Best food in Portland." His voice carried a pride I hadn't heard in years. Amanda, for her part, began showing up at family dinners hosted by Rachel in Seattle. She didn't dominate the conversation. She didn't dismiss me. She simply sat, present, respectful. I didn't let myself melt at every little thing. I'd been burned before, but I noticed. And though I didn't say it out loud, a part of me appreciated the effort. The real test came on my birthday. In past years, Daniel and Amanda had treated my birthday as an afterthought, a card if I was lucky, sometimes a last-minute dinner. Rachel had always carried the weight of making it special. But this year was different. When I opened the restaurant that morning, Rachel was already there, smiling, carrying balloons. And behind her came Daniel and Amanda. They had decorated one of the tables with a small cake, candles, and even a handmade banner that said, "Happy Birthday, Mom." I stood frozen, overwhelmed, as Daniel lit the candles. Amanda actually sang, her voice soft but steady. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an afterthought. Of course, I'd be lying if I said the hurt disappeared overnight. It didn't. There were moments when Amanda's smile still felt forced, when Daniel's attempt still carried a hint of guilt rather than genuine desire. Trust isn't rebuilt in a season. It takes years. But for the first time, I wasn't carrying the entire weight of the relationship. They were finally putting in the work. And that, to me, was redemption enough. Still, late at night when I sat alone in the restaurant after closing, I'd find myself questioning. Was I being too forgiving? Too cautious? Too proud? Forgiveness is tricky. It's not about forgetting what happened. It's about deciding if the relationship you have left is worth nurturing despite the scar. Sometimes, I thought about the lilies Amanda had left. How they were a silent acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. How, in her own imperfect way, she was trying to rewrite the story of that night. And sometimes, I thought about Daniel's voice when he told his co-workers about me. The pride, the love buried under years of neglect, finally surfacing again. Maybe redemption doesn't erase betrayal. Maybe it just builds something new beside it. Something imperfect, but real. That summer, I found myself laughing again. Not the polite chuckles I had perfected over years of being dismissed, but real, belly-deep laughter. Rachel teased Daniel. Amanda rolled her eyes but joined in. And I sat back, watching my fractured family stitch itself together in uneven, awkward, but undeniably honest ways. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. If you were in my shoes, would you let them back in? Would you accept small gestures as proof of change? Or would you hold firm and keep the door shut? I know what I chose, but I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where someone hurt you deeply and then tried to make amends in small ways? Did you give them another chance? For me, the answer was simple though not easy. Yes, I let them back in. Slowly, cautiously, with boundaries that I never let slip. Because forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the past. It means acknowledging it, learning from it, and deciding that the love you have left is worth more than the pain you endured. And while I'll never forget the empty chair at my grand opening, I also won't forget the lilies on my doorstep. Both moments are part of the story. Both shaped who I am today. Resolution isn't neat. It doesn't come tied in a bow, with everyone smiling at the end like a family in a Hallmark movie. Real resolution is quieter, messier. It looks like conversations that don't solve everything, but move the needle an inch forward. It feels like laughter that comes more easily, but still carries a shadow of what was lost. It's about learning to live with both the scar and the healing. By the time autumn settled over Portland, with leaves swirling through the streets and the air crisp with the smell of rain, I felt a strange peace. Not perfect happiness, just peace. The restaurant had become more than I ever dreamed it could be. On Friday nights, every table was full. Families gathered, couples lingered over wine, and groups of friends laughed so hard it rattled the glasses. I watched it all from behind the counter sometimes, my heart swelling with quiet pride. This was mine, my creation, my sanctuary, and no one could take that away. Daniel still came by, sometimes with Amanda, sometimes alone. He never mentioned the grand opening anymore, never tried to explain it away. Instead, he simply showed up, bringing flowers once, recommending my food to strangers, even rolling up his sleeves one night to help wash dishes when we were short-staffed. Amanda, to my surprise, softened. She still had her sharp edges, but she began to let small cracks show. One evening, after dinner at Rachel's, she pulled me aside and said quietly, "I know I've been difficult. I'm trying." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes that's enough. The biggest change, though, wasn't in them. It was in me. For so long, I had believed my worth was tied to how much I gave, how much I sacrificed, how much I bent myself into shapes that kept others comfortable. But now, standing in my thriving restaurant, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, I finally understood. My worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition. It was mine all along. The revenge, the silence, the boundaries, they hadn't just punished Daniel and Amanda. They had freed me. That fall, I bought myself a gift. A new set of keys. Not just to the restaurant, but to a small cabin I rented out in Hood River, overlooking the Columbia River Gorge. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. A place where I could sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watch the fog roll over the water, and remember that life was bigger than betrayal. Sometimes Rachel came with me, bringing her kids. Sometimes Daniel joined us, awkward, but trying. Amanda came once, sitting quietly by the fire, and for the first time, I saw her as something other than the woman who had hurt me. I saw her as human, flawed, imperfect, but trying. And on nights when I sat alone in that cabin, I'd think about that empty chair at my grand opening. The one I had decorated with lilies, waiting for Daniel and Amanda to walk through the door. It still hurt even now. Maybe it always would. But then I'd remember the lilies Amanda had left on my doorstep. The birthday banner Daniel had helped hang. The laughter we shared months later, awkward but real. And I realized that the empty chair didn't define me. The lilies did. The banner did. The laughter did. Because revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about building yourself back up so strong that no one can dismiss you again. If you've read this far, I want to thank you. Truly. Writing and sharing my story hasn't been easy. It takes hours of reflection, typing, editing, and reliving painful memories. If you found any piece of strength or inspiration in my journey, please consider subscribing. It's such a small act for you, but it means the world to me. It helps me keep sharing stories that might just make someone out there feel less alone. The resolution wasn't flashy. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I learned that boundaries don't push people away. They reveal who's willing to step up and stay. I learned that love can survive betrayal, but only if respect is rebuilt alongside it. And most importantly, I learned that my dreams, my worth, and my happiness were never dependent on anyone else's approval. When I lock up the restaurant at night, I sometimes look at that corner table by the window, the one I once saved for Daniel and Amanda. Now it's rarely empty. Couples sit there, hands intertwined. Friends share secrets over coffee. Families laugh until their bellies ache. That table is no longer a symbol of absence. It's a symbol of life, of love, of second chances. And maybe, just maybe, that's resolution enough. Symbols have a way of clinging to us. Sometimes it's a scent, sometimes a sound, sometimes a single image burns so deeply into memory that it shapes everything that comes after. For me, it was that empty chair. The one by the window, set with fresh lilies, gleaming silverware, and all the weight of my hope. The one Daniel and Amanda never sat in. The one that broke something inside me that night. But over time, the meaning of that chair began to shift. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. The lunch rush had ended, and I was clearing tables when I noticed a young couple standing awkwardly at the door. They looked nervous, clutching hands like lifelines. First time here? I asked, smiling. They nodded, and I led them straight to the window seat, the chair that once symbolized abandonment. At first, I hesitated. My chest tightened. That chair had been around for so long. But as I watched them settle in, order nervously, then relax into laughter, something shifted in me. That chair wasn't empty anymore. It was full of life, of love, of possibility. And I realized then, symbols only hold the meaning we give them. The lilies, too, took on new meaning. For months after Amanda left that bouquet on my doorstep, I kept a vase of lilies in the restaurant, not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of transformation. What had once marked an empty absence now marked a tentative step toward reconciliation. Guests started noticing. "You always have lilies here," one woman remarked. I smiled. They remind me that even something painful can grow into something beautiful if you let it. And I meant it. But symbolic closure didn't come from objects alone. It came from conversations, the kind you don't plan, but stumble into. One evening, after dinner at Rachel's house in Seattle, Daniel lingered while everyone else cleaned up. He stood at the sink, rinsing plates, his shoulders hunched. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low, "I think about that night all the time. About how I didn't come. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for it." I paused, setting down the dish towel. For a moment, the mother in me wanted to rush in, to comfort him, to erase his guilt. But I didn't. Instead, I put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Daniel, I've already forgiven you." The question is whether you can forgive yourself. He looked at me then, eyes raw, and for the first time in years, I saw my son, not the man weighed down by pride and obligation, but the boy who once clung to me when thunderstorms rattled the windows. That moment was worth more than any grand apology. Amanda's moment came later, and in her own way. It was Thanksgiving, hosted at my restaurant for the first time. The place was filled with neighbors, friends, and family, my chosen circle, not just the one I was born into. As the evening wound down, Amanda approached me quietly. She held out a small box. Inside was a delicate silver charm shaped like a lily. "I don't expect you to forget," she said, her voice soft. "But I wanted you to know I remember." It wasn't flowery. It wasn't perfect. But it was sincere. And for Amanda, sincerity was the truest gift she could give. Symbols matter because they mark our journey. The chair, the lilies, the charm, all of them told the story of where I had been and how far I had come. But closure didn't come from those symbols alone. It came from the way I chose to reinterpret them. The empty chair was no longer abandonment. It was space for new life. The lilies were no longer grief. They were growth. The charm was no longer apology. It was acknowledgement. Closure wasn't about erasing the past. It was about rewriting the meaning of the moments that once broke me. That winter, I sat alone in my Hood River cabin, watching snow fall gently outside. A fire crackled in the hearth, and on the table beside me sat a vase of lilies and the silver charm Amanda had given me. I thought about that first night, the hurt, the humiliation, the phone call that left me stunned. And I thought about everything that followed. The revenge, the fallout, the confrontation, the redemption, the resolution. I had lived the full circle. And in that moment, sipping tea in the quiet glow of firelight, I realized I no longer felt the sting of betrayal. I felt gratitude, not for the hurt, but for the strength it had forced me to find. Because without that empty chair, I might never have built the life I had now. Closure isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending. Closure is looking at the symbols that once cut you open and realizing they no longer have the power to wound you. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, the snow still falling outside, I knew that the woman who once stood in her restaurant fighting back tears was gone. In her place was someone stronger, whole, at peace. Life rarely gives us neat endings. More often, it gives us circles, paths that loop back on themselves until you find yourself standing in a place that looks familiar, but feels entirely different because you've changed. That's what the end of this journey felt like to me. Full circle. It was exactly 1 year after the grand opening. The restaurant was buzzing with life, every table full, the air rich with the smell of roasted garlic and warm bread. Friends laughed, couples clinked glasses, children squirmed in their seats with excitement. The hum of conversation filled every corner, and I stood by the counter, watching it all unfold. But my eyes kept drifting to the table by the window, the one that had haunted me. This time it wasn't empty. Rachel sat there with her kids, their faces lit with joy. Daniel and Amanda sat beside them, talking softly, their hands linked under the table. It wasn't a perfect picture, not polished, not flawless, but it was real. The same chair that once symbolized betrayal now symbolized something else entirely. Survival, reconciliation, and growth. After dessert, Rachel raised her glass. "To Mom," she said, her voice warm. "To her strength, her stubbornness, and to the restaurant that brought us all back together." Everyone clapped, even Amanda. And for once, I didn't feel the hollow ache of being dismissed or overlooked. I felt seen, fully. I raised my own glass, smiling. To family, imperfect, complicated, but worth fighting for. Later that night, after the last guest left and the doorbell's final chime faded into silence, I walked to the window table and sat down. I ran my fingers across the wood, remembering the lilies I had placed there, the hours I had spent staring at that empty chair, waiting for people who never came. And then I looked at the same spot now, filled with laughter and warmth, and I realized I had taken control of the story. That table no longer owned me. I owned it. The full circle wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about forgiveness. It was about self-worth. For so long, I had given and given, hoping love would be returned in equal measure. For so long, I believed that being overlooked was just my lot in life. But now I knew better. I knew that my worth wasn't tied to who showed up for me. It was tied to the fact that I had always shown up for myself. That even when I stood alone in an empty restaurant, humiliated and heartbroken, I still had the courage to keep going, to build, to fight. That was my justice. That was my victory. When people hear this story, they often ask, was it worth it? Was the revenge satisfying? Did they ever truly make it up to you? And here's my answer. The revenge wasn't about them. It was about me. Every refusal, every boundary, every quiet act of reclaiming my dignity, it wasn't to punish Daniel and Amanda. It was to teach myself that I deserved better, that I wasn't invisible, that my dream, my work, my life had value, even if the people closest to me couldn't see it at first. Yes, there were consequences for them. Yes, they felt the sting of being excluded, ignored, or exposed. But the true satisfaction wasn't in their discomfort. It was in my freedom. The freedom to live without begging for their attention. The freedom to thrive without their approval. The freedom to sit in that restaurant, surrounded by laughter and light, and know that I built this. Me. Alone. And that was enough. Now, when I think about my story, I don't just think about betrayal. I think about resilience. I think about Rachel's unwavering support. About the neighbors who came to my grand opening when my own family didn't. About the customers who became friends. The community that wrapped itself around me when I needed it most. And yes, I think about Daniel and Amanda, not with bitterness, but with perspective. Because in the end, they did show up. Not when I wanted, not when I begged, but when I stopped waiting and started living for myself. Sometimes that's how people learn. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Don't wait for an empty chair to be filled. Don't measure your worth by who chooses to show up. Build your life, your dream, your joy, regardless of who claps for you. Because when you do, you'll find that the right people, the ones who truly see you, will gather around you in their own time. And the wrong ones will fade into the background where they belong. That's not just revenge. That's justice. That's growth. As I lock up the restaurant now, I no longer glance at the door hoping someone will walk through. I no longer ache when I see the chair by the window. Instead, I smile. Because I know the truth, I've already won.